Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. In a quiet British town, families lived ordinary lives, never knowing that a monster walked among them. He was polite, he was trusted, and he looked like everyone else. But behind closed doors, he carried a secret darker than anyone could. Imagine. This is the story of Arthur Green, Britain's most twisted killer you've never heard of. And tonight, we reveal how he fooled an entire town for years, until science finally exposed the truth. The town of Ashford in the late 1970s was the kind of place where people felt safe. The streets were lined with small shops, families walked home together after dinner, and children played outside until the evening light faded. It was not the sort of town where anyone expected terrible secrets to hide. Yet in the heart of that quiet community lived a man named Arthur Green, who carried darkness with him everywhere he went. Arthur looked like an ordinary man. He was in his mid-30s, tall but not remarkable, with brown hair that he kept neatly trimmed. He worked as a mechanic at a local garage, fixing cars for people who trusted him. Customers described him as polite, quiet, and hard-working. He rented a small house on the edge of town, and no one ever saw much activity there. To his neighbors, Arthur was simply another face they passed on the street, but Arthur Green was not like the others. From a young age, he had felt different. His childhood had been marked by loneliness and cruelty. His father was strict and often violent, and his mother kept her distance, leaving Arthur to grow up feeling unwanted. As he grew older, those feelings hardened into something more dangerous. He developed twisted urges that he kept hidden, wearing a mask of normalcy that fooled everyone around him. In Ashford, life continued as it always had. Women walked home late from shifts at the factories and hospitals, confident that the streets were safe. Friends met in the pubs, laughing over pints of beer, while couples strolled along the quiet lanes. No one suspected that a predator was watching from the shadows, studying their movements, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Arthur often spent his evenings driving slowly through town in an old car he had repaired himself. He would watch the people, his eyes following women as they walked alone. He did not stand out. Many men drove home late after work, but inside Arthur's mind, he was choosing targets. He learned which streets were quiet at night, which alleys stayed dark, and which paths women took when no one else was around. His small house reflected his secret life. To anyone who stepped inside, it looked plain: a sofa, a table, a shelf with a few books. But hidden behind a locked door in the back was a room that no one else knew about. Inside that room, Arthur kept things he should not have kept. Items. He had stolen objects that fed his fantasies, reminders of the darkness he carried. That room was his world, the place where he felt in control. At work, Arthur played the part of a normal man. He fixed cars, joked lightly with co-workers, and sometimes joined them for a drink after hours. But he never let anyone get too close. People thought he was shy, perhaps a little odd, but not dangerous. No one could have guessed that behind his calm smile was a man planning terrible acts. In the summer of 1977, Arthur began to focus on a young woman named Linda Brooks. Linda worked the night shift at a local factory, often walking home in the early morning hours when the streets were quiet. She was 22, with brown hair and a gentle smile, known to her friends as kind and hard-working. To Arthur, she was an opportunity. He watched her carefully, learning her routine, waiting for a night when she would be alone. The people of Ashford were unaware of the storm that was about to fall on them. They trusted their routines, their town, and each other. Even Linda felt safe as she walked home at dawn, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. She had no reason to believe that anyone was following her. Arthur had already made his decision. He had chosen Linda, and in his mind, There was no turning back. His quiet mask remained in place during the day, but at night, his true self stirred in the shadows. He was ready to act on the darkness that had lived inside him for years. The night Linda disappeared, few noticed at first. She did not return home after her shift, but friends assumed she was staying with someone. By morning, her absence was clear, and her family began to worry. They called the police, who asked questions but did not suspect anything unusual. People went missing from time to time, and in those early hours, there was still hope she would come back. But Linda Brooks would never return. Arthur, meanwhile, acted as though nothing had happened. He went to work the next day, fixing cars and speaking politely to customers. No one noticed the faint change in his eyes, the quiet satisfaction he carried. He had stepped fully into the life he had always imagined, and the mask of normalcy kept him hidden. The disappearance of Linda marked the beginning of something much darker. The people of Ashford did not know it yet, but their quiet town had become the hunting ground of Britain's most twisted killer, and Arthur Green was just getting started. Days passed after Linda Brooks vanished, and the worry in Ashford began to grow. At first, people believed she might have gone to visit a friend or left town for a short trip, but as her absence stretched longer, her family knew something was terribly wrong. Linda had been reliable, always showing up for her shifts at the factory, always calling her mother when she would be late. This silence was not like her. The police began asking questions. Officers walked through the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her that night. A few neighbors remembered hearing footsteps, but in a town where people often worked late hours, it had not seemed unusual. One man said he saw Linda pass by under a street lamp, but he could not remember if anyone was following her. The investigation moved slowly, with no clear leads. Then, 3 weeks later, a group of children playing near the woods made a horrifying discovery. Beneath a layer of fallen leaves, not far from an old railway line, they found the body of Linda Brooks. The police were called immediately, and the area was sealed off. Detectives who arrived at the scene were shaken. Linda's injuries showed she had been stalked and attacked with disturbing violence. Whoever had done this had taken their time, and it was clear this was not a random act. The news spread quickly. The town that had once felt safe was now gripped by fear. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. Families kept their doors locked even during the day. Pubs and shops, whispers filled the air. People spoke of a monster living among them, someone who looked ordinary but carried evil inside. Arthur Green kept his mask in place. He went to work as usual, offering polite nods and fixing cars with steady hands. Neighbors who spoke to him saw nothing unusual. To them, he was still the quiet mechanic who minded his own business. Inside, however, Arthur felt a thrill he had never known before. He read the newspapers carefully, studying the police statements. He listened to the fear in people's voices, and it gave him a sense of control. The detectives working on the case felt pressure from every side. They searched the woods for evidence, combing through branches and soil for any clue. A button was found near Linda's body, but it did not match her clothing. Investigators thought it might belong to the killer, but with so many people in the area wearing similar coats, it was impossible to narrow down. Fingerprints were taken, but the technology of the time was limited, and nothing useful came back. Linda's funeral brought hundreds of people together. Her family wept as the small church filled with mourners. The priest spoke of her kindness, her hard work, and the unfairness of her death. Outside, people stood in silence, heads bowed, the fear heavy in the air. Everyone looked at one another, differently that day, wondering who among them could be responsible. Arthur attended the funeral, standing quietly at the back. No one thought it strange. Many townspeople came to show respect. He blended in, offering a solemn expression, his eyes lowered. Inside, though, he studied the crowd, watching the grief, feeding on the atmosphere. He knew no one suspected him, and that gave him confidence. The police followed several false leads. A man from a nearby town was arrested after a witness claimed. He looked suspicious, but he was released when his alibi checked out. Another local worker was questioned for days, but no evidence linked him to the crime. Each failure deepened the town's anger and frustration. People began to say the police were useless, that they could not protect anyone. For Arthur, this was the perfect cover. The more the police stumbled, the more invisible he became. He felt untouchable, a shadow walking among them. But deep inside, he also felt restless. The thrill of Linda's murder had begun to fade, and he found himself looking at other women, in town with the same cold hunger. One evening, Arthur sat in the back of a pub, sipping his drink slowly. Around him, men argued about the killer, each offering a theory. Some said it must be an outsider, someone passing through who would soon be gone. Others insisted it was a local, hiding in plain sight. Arthur listened quietly, hiding a small smile behind his glass. They were right. The killer was local, and he was sitting among them at that very moment. As the weeks turned into months, the case of Linda Brooks remained unsolved. Her family pleaded for justice. Her friends lived in fear, and the town tried to move forward, though trust had been broken. The police promised they would not give up, but privately, many officers admitted they had little to work with. Arthur, meanwhile, spent more nights driving slowly through the streets, his eyes scanning for another opportunity. He had learned, from Linda, learned how to strike and hide. His mind told him he was smarter than the police, smarter than everyone else. He believed he could kill again and still remain unseen. And in the winter of 1979, he would prove himself right. By the winter of 1979, Ashford was a town divided between fear and denial. Some people believed Linda Brooks had been killed by a stranger who had already left the area. Others whispered that the killer was still among them, watching from the shadows. Families tightened their routines, keeping children close, warning daughters not to walk alone. But as weeks passed with no new attack, a false sense of calm began to return. That calm would not last. Arthur Green was restless. The satisfaction he had felt after killing Linda was fading. At first, he replayed the memory in his mind again and again, but over time it lost its sharpness. He needed something new to bring back the feeling. To the world, he was still the quiet mechanic, fixing cars and greeting neighbors politely. Inside, he was planning his next move. In February, another woman vanished. Her name was Susan Clark, a nurse at the local hospital. She was 26, known for her kindness and long hours caring for patients. On the night she disappeared, she left the hospital just after midnight, walking toward her small flat nearby. She never arrived. By morning, her co-workers reported her missing, and fear surged back into the town. Police searched the route she usually took, questioning anyone who had seen her that night. A taxi driver reported seeing a woman who looked like Susan speaking briefly to a man in a dark coat near a street lamp, but he could not describe the man's face. Others heard footsteps in the fog, but thought nothing of it at the time. For days, search parties combed the town and surrounding fields. Then, after nearly 2 weeks, Susan's body was found near the river. The injuries were disturbingly similar to those suffered by Linda Brooks. The police could no longer deny it. A serial killer was at work in Ashford. The town reacted with shock and anger. Fear turned into outrage. Women demanded better protection. Families begged for answers, and the newspapers once again filled their pages with stories of the Ashford killer. Detectives worked day and night, but their progress was slow. They had little to go on besides vague descriptions and the grim pattern that was beginning to emerge. Arthur read every article, smiling to himself as the headlines grew more dramatic. He saw himself in the words, the faceless figure the newspapers described. Yet he also knew how well he had hidden his true self. To his neighbors, he was still harmless Arthur, the man who fixed their cars and kept to himself. The thought of being invisible gave him confidence, even as the entire town hunted for him. In the spring of 1980, another victim was taken. This time, it was Megan Lewis, a college student who had recently moved to Ashford for her studies. She was only 19, with bright red hair and an easy laugh that made her popular among friends. She vanished one Friday night after leaving a cafe where she had been studying. Her friends thought she had gone home early, but when she didn't return the next morning, they knew something was wrong. The discovery of her body came only days later, hidden in an abandoned shed on the edge of town. The brutality was shocking. The similarities to Linda and Susan were undeniable. The police held a press conference, finally admitting that the town was dealing with a serial killer. They warned women not to walk alone at night, and they increased patrols across Ashford. But fear had already consumed the community. For Arthur, each new crime deepened his obsession. He was no longer simply hiding, he was thriving in the attention. He clipped newspaper articles, carefully storing them in his secret room. He replayed the fear in people's faces, savoring the control he held over the town. His mask of normalcy never slipped. At work, he nodded politely, offered small smiles, and kept conversations short. But inside, his thoughts grew darker, and his hunger for control grew stronger. The detectives tried to connect the dots. They created charts with names, dates, and locations. They interviewed men across town, checking alibis and searching for anyone with a history of violence. Several men were brought in for questioning, but none could be tied to the murders. Each failure left the town more desperate and the police more humiliated. In the pubs, people speculated about the killer. Some said it had to be a stranger passing through, a traveler who only came into Ashford at night. Others insisted it was a local man who blended in, someone no one would ever suspect. Friends looked at each other with doubt. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Trust was breaking apart. Arthur enjoyed this part the most. He would sit quietly in the corner of a pub, listening as people described the killer, never knowing he was among them. Sometimes he even joined the conversation, offering cautious words about how terrible it all was. No one ever suspected him. The pattern of his crimes became clearer. He targeted women who walked alone at night, often after work or study when the streets were quiet. He attacked quickly, leaving little behind. The police believed he must be watching his victims beforehand, learning their routines. They were right. But they had no idea that the man doing it was someone they saw every day. By the end of 1980, Ashford had changed forever. Women no longer walked alone, families locked their doors as soon as the sun set, and the streets emptied quickly after dark. The town lived under the shadow of the killer, waiting for the next victim, praying it would not be someone they loved. Arthur Green, the quiet mechanic, walked among them unnoticed, carrying the darkest secret of all. He had killed 3 women, and he was already thinking about his 4th. By the early 1980s, Arthur Green was no longer just living a double life. He was perfecting it. To the people of Ashford, he was still the quiet mechanic who worked hard, kept to himself, and caused no trouble. To himself, he was something far darker. A predator who had claimed 3 lives and was planning for more. The mask he wore in public was strong, and no one suspected what he was hiding behind it. Arthur's small house looked ordinary from the outside. A faded roof, a cracked stone path, and a small yard that he never bothered to maintain. But inside, it was carefully arranged to support his deception. The front room was plain, almost boring. A sofa, a table, and a few shelves with old books. Visitors saw nothing unusual, which was exactly what Arthur wanted. Few ever entered beyond that room. At the back of the house, behind a locked door that only he had the key to, was the place where his true self lived. The secret room was dark and windowless. The air smelled of dust and metal. On the walls hung shelves filled with items he had taken from his victims, trophies that fed his memories, a scarf, a broken watch, a silver locket, a photograph. Each one was neatly labeled and placed as if part of a collection. In the center of the room sat an old wooden chair and a desk. On the desk lay newspapers, carefully clipped and saved, each article about the Ashford murders. Arthur read them, over and over, tracing the words with his finger, smiling at how the world spoke about the faceless killer. He relived the fear through those pages, feeling powerful as he studied the details that police and reporters could not solve. Sometimes, Arthur would sit in that chair for hours, staring at the objects he had stolen. In those moments, the ordinary mask of the mechanic fell away completely. Here he was not pretending to be normal. Here he was the killer, the one in control. He imagined himself as smarter than the police, stronger than the town, untouchable in his hidden world. Outside the secret room, life continued as if nothing had changed. Arthur woke early, went to work at the garage, fixed cars, and nodded politely to customers. He shared short conversations with coworkers, though never too much. People thought he was quiet, perhaps shy, but dependable. He paid his rent on time, waved politely to neighbors, and drank occasionally at the pub. He seemed so ordinary that suspicion never touched him. Yet the cracks in his mask were there, if anyone had looked closely enough. He avoided long conversations about the murders, though he sometimes pretended to care. He never spoke about his own life, keeping his past hidden. And at times his eyes lingered too long on women walking alone, a dark hunger flickering before he turned away. But in a town filled with worry and fear, no one noticed these small details. The police were growing desperate. 3 women had been killed in just a few years, and the cases remained unsolved. Detectives formed special teams, poring over every piece of evidence. They checked alibis, interviewed suspects, and tried to find connections. Some believed the killer was a local, someone hiding in plain sight. Others argued it must be a traveler, slipping in and out of Ashford without leaving a trace. The debates went in circles, and Arthur smiled, knowing he was hidden right in front of them. Arthur's killings had given him confidence, but also restlessness. He began to spend more nights driving through the town, watching people from the shadows. He learned the routines of those around him, memorizing when women walked alone, when the streets were quiet, when opportunity waited. He enjoyed the hunt as much as the act itself. The control, the planning, the sense of power filled the emptiness inside him. Still, Arthur knew he had to be careful. He had seen other killers caught in the newspapers, men who made mistakes or grew careless. He told himself he was different. He believed his intelligence and patience set him apart. He could pretend to be normal for as long as he needed. But deep down, he knew his urges would not let him stay quiet forever. By 1981, whispers filled Ashford. People no longer believed the killer was gone. They spoke about him in hushed tones, calling him the Ashford Shadow. Some claimed to have seen him, a figure in a dark coat lurking near the woods, though none of these stories were ever proven. Parents warned their daughters again, and women walked in groups whenever possible. Fear had returned, and with it, the uneasy sense that the killer was still watching. Arthur relished the fear. He felt it gave him power over the town. He looked at people in the market or the pub and thought to himself, "They have no idea it's me." That secret thrilled him, making him feel larger than life. But the hunger inside him was growing again. His trophies and memories could not hold him forever. He needed another victim, another way to feel the rush. He began to notice a woman named Claire Morgan. She was 24, working at a local shop, often walking home alone in the evenings. Arthur watched her for weeks, learning her habits. He followed her at a distance, making sure she never saw him. He told himself she would be his next choice, but fate would not allow this one to go as planned. One night, Arthur followed Claire down a narrow street. She felt uneasy, sensing someone behind her. When she turned, she caught a glimpse of a man in the shadows. Fear filled her, and she ran. Arthur gave chase, but Claire's cries brought attention from nearby houses. Lights came on, and windows opened. Arthur slipped away into the darkness, furious that his plan had failed. Claire's escape shook the town once more. She told the police about the man in the shadows, describing him as tall with a dark coat. The description was vague, but it was the closest anyone had come to identifying the killer. Police searched again, questioning more men, including Arthur. He answered calmly, showing no fear. With no evidence, he was released. To the police, he was just another quiet mechanic. To Arthur, it was proof that his mask still protected him, but the near miss changed things. Arthur realized he could not stay still forever. The police were watching more closely now. He needed to be smarter, more careful, more patient. Yet at the same time, the hunger inside him demanded more. The mask of Arthur Green was still in place, but the cracks were beginning to spread. Claire Morgan's escape changed the atmosphere in Ashford overnight. Until then, the killer had seemed untouchable, invisible, a shadow no one could catch. But now there was a witness. Claire's description was not detailed, but it gave shape to the fear. She spoke of a tall man in a dark coat moving fast in the shadows, his presence cold and dangerous. For the first time, people felt that the killer could be real, not just a ghost. The police acted quickly. They increased patrols, searching the streets at night with more officers. They questioned men in the town, focusing on those who matched Claire's vague description. Some were taken in for long interviews, but none could be tied directly to the murders. Among the men questioned was Arthur Green. Arthur had prepared himself. When detectives asked where he had been on the night Claire was attacked, he calmly explained he had been working late in his garage, fixing a customer's car. He even produced the repair slip as proof. His voice was steady, his face calm, his manner so ordinary that the detectives found nothing suspicious. Once again, Arthur's mask held strong. He was released, and the police turned their attention elsewhere, but the escape had rattled him. For the first time, Arthur had been close to being exposed. He replayed the night in his mind, cursing himself for chasing Claire down a street too close to the houses. He realized how easily he could have been caught, and yet the fear of exposure did not stop him. Instead, it stirred something else inside him, a reckless hunger, a belief that he was still smarter than everyone around him. Claire, meanwhile, lived in fear. She refused to walk home alone, and her family begged her to leave Ashford for a safer town. She became a symbol in the community, proof that the killer was real and still walking among them. Her story fueled more outrage against the police, who had still not caught the man responsible for so many deaths. Arthur watched all of this quietly, pretending to be concerned like everyone else. He even offered kind words to a neighbor who mentioned Claire's escape, shaking his head at the horror of it. No one suspected that the man they were speaking to was the very figure Claire had run from. The police, under growing pressure, brought in outside help. Detectives from larger cities arrived to review the case files. They studied the timelines, the locations, and the evidence. A new theory began to form. The killer was not an outsider. He lived in Ashford. He knew the streets too well, and he returned to them too often. He blended in so well that no one noticed him. This theory brought the investigation closer to Arthur than ever before. His name appeared quietly on a list of men to be watched, though detectives did not yet focus heavily on him. He was still just the quiet mechanic, invisible in his ordinariness. But Arthur himself was growing careless. His hunger for control and violence was returning, stronger than before. The failed attack on Claire had left him unsatisfied. He needed another victim, and soon. In late 1982, Arthur found his opportunity. A young woman named Rachel Moore, a shop assistant, often worked late shifts. She walked home through the quieter parts of town, her path dimly lit by a few scattered lamps. Arthur had noticed her weeks earlier and had followed her more than once, testing the routine, learning when the streets were empty. One cold November night, he struck. Rachel did not return home. By morning, her family reported her missing, and fear ripped through Ashford again. This time, the police responded with urgency, searching every alley, field, and riverbank. 3 days later, Rachel's body was discovered in the woods, her death as brutal as the others. The pattern was undeniable. The Ashford killer had returned. The community's outrage exploded. Protests were held outside the police station. Families demanded justice. Women refused to walk alone at night, and some left their jobs rather than risk the dark streets. The newspapers spread the story beyond Ashford, calling the case one of Britain's most chilling, unsolved series of murders. The pressure on detectives reached breaking point. Arthur read every headline. He watched the protests from a distance. He listened to people curse the killer in the pubs. And through it all, he remained calm, blending into the background, but in the privacy of his locked room, he smiled at the fear he had created. He added Rachel's belongings to his collection, placing them carefully on the shelves with the others. His secret world grew more twisted with every item he stored. The detectives, though, were closer than Arthur realized. New forensic methods were beginning to change investigations in the early 1980s. DNA evidence was still in its infancy, but small advances allowed scientists to preserve and test traces from crime scenes. Investigators sent samples from Linda, Brooks's case, to a lab, hoping for results in the future. In the meantime, they built profiles of possible suspects. They looked for men who were quiet, solitary, and who knew the area well. Arthur Green's name surfaced again, noted for his solitary life and his habit of driving late at night. Detectives began to watch him more carefully, though Arthur remained confident that his mask would protect him, but the cracks were widening. A co-worker noticed how Arthur sometimes stared too long at women passing by the garage. A neighbor thought, "It's strange that Arthur often worked late with no visitors." Small details began to collect in the minds of those around him. Though no one yet dared to accuse him, Arthur's recklessness grew after Rachel's death. He believed he was untouchable, even as the police drew closer. He convinced himself he could keep killing without being caught. What he did not know was that time was running out, and the net around him was beginning to tighten. By the mid-1980s, the people of Ashford lived in a state of constant unease. The murders had stretched across years, and the police still had no clear answers. Families locked their doors before the sun went down, women traveled in groups, and the streets emptied long before midnight. The killer had become part of everyday conversation, his shadow never leaving the town. Yet through all of this, Arthur Green continued to move quietly through life, his mask of normalcy protecting him. Arthur was confident. He had killed several women, and each time the police had failed to catch him. Even when Claire Morgan had escaped, even when detectives had questioned him, he had slipped free. He believed he was untouchable. At work, he was the quiet mechanic, dependable and polite. In his private room, hidden behind a locked door, he was the killer, the collector of trophies, the man who felt powerful in his secret world. But the world outside was changing. Science was moving forward, and detectives were learning new methods that would change the way crimes were solved. DNA testing was still in its early stages, but it was beginning to offer results. Samples that had been collected years earlier, stored carefully by hopeful investigators, were now being studied with new techniques. For the first time, there was a chance that the Ashford killer might be identified. Detectives sent material, from Linda Brooks's case to a lab. Weeks later, a report came back suggesting that there was enough genetic material to compare to suspects. The news gave police new energy. They began to focus on a smaller list of men who matched the profile of the killer. Arthur Green's name was there once again. Surveillance began quietly. Officers followed Arthur on his late-night drives, noting how often he circled the same streets. They watched his house, marking when lights went on and off, who came and went. The truth was, no one ever came. Arthur lived alone, isolated, and secretive. That detail only made detectives more suspicious. Arthur noticed he was being watched. He saw unfamiliar cars parked near the garage, men pretending to read newspapers on corners. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of fear. He told himself it was nothing, that the police were wasting their time. But in the quiet of his secret room, surrounded by his trophies, he began to wonder if his mask would hold forever. The investigation grew tighter. Detectives obtained a sample from Arthur's garage, a discarded cigarette butt left in the ashtray. They sent it to the lab for comparison. Weeks later, the results came back. The DNA matched the material taken from Linda Brooks's case. The evidence was clear. Arthur Green was the Ashford killer. Still, the police waited. They needed more than one piece of evidence to make the case strong. They wanted to know what was inside Arthur's house. Late one night, while Arthur was out, they entered with a warrant. What they found stunned them. Behind the locked door at the back of the house, they discovered his secret room. The shelves lined with trophies told the story of every victim. Linda's broken watch, Susan's scarf, Megan's locket, Rachel's small purse. Each item was carefully placed, labeled in Arthur's handwriting. On the desk were stacks of newspapers. Every article about the murders, some with lines underlined, as if Arthur had studied them like a student. Detectives stood in silence, realizing they were standing in the heart of the nightmare that had haunted Ashford for nearly a decade. Photographs were taken, evidence collected, and the room sealed. When Arthur returned home later that night, he was met with flashing lights and armed officers. His mask of normalcy finally shattered. Arthur was calm when they arrested him. He did not fight, did not shout. He simply lowered his head as the handcuffs clicked shut. Neighbors stood outside, watching in disbelief. To them, Arthur Green had always been the quiet mechanic, the man who nodded politely in the mornings. Now they learned he had been Britain's most twisted killer, living among them all along. At the police station, detectives confronted him with the evidence. Arthur refused to speak. He sat silently, his face expressionless, as they laid out the DNA results and the trophies from his room. His silence was chilling, as if he felt no need to explain or deny what he had done. For years, he had controlled the story. Now the truth was in the hands of others. The news of his arrest spread quickly. Newspapers across the country printed his face on their front pages, calling him the Ashford Monster. Families of the victims wept with relief. Finally, seeing justice after years of fear, the town that had lived in the shadow of the killer could breathe again, though the scars would never fully heal. Arthur's trial was set, and the details of his double life shocked the public. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite. Co-workers called him dependable. No one had suspected that behind closed doors he was keeping a room full of trophies, planning murders with cold precision. The jury listened in silence as prosecutors described his crimes. The DNA evidence, the trophies, and the testimony of Claire Morgan, the survivor, sealed his fate. Arthur Green was found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In his cell, Arthur returned to silence. He rarely spoke, even to guards or other prisoners. Some said he still felt powerful, holding on to the secrets he never revealed. Others believed he was broken, stripped of the control he once held. Either way, his mask had finally been removed, and the world saw the monster beneath. Arthur Green's conviction brought a sense of closure to Ashford, but it did not erase the years of fear the town had endured. The quiet streets, once filled with laughter and routine, would forever carry the memory of the shadow that had haunted them. Families who had lost loved ones attended the trial every day, listening to the details of his crimes, their faces lined with pain. For them, justice was a relief, but it could not bring back what they had lost. The trial revealed more than the murders themselves. Detectives shared evidence from Arthur's secret room, the trophies he had collected, and the way he had cataloged his crimes like a twisted historian. The photographs of the room stunned the public. Shelves lined with scarves, watches, purses, and jewelry, each one linked to a life taken. People asked themselves how a man so ordinary, a man they had trusted with their cars and greeted in the streets, could live such a double life. Reporters filled the newspapers with stories about him. They called him Britain's most twisted killer. Yet outside of Ashford, his name never reached the same infamy as other criminals. Perhaps it was because he lacked the spectacle, the showy madness of others. Arthur was quiet, methodical, and almost invisible. He killed not for fame, but for control. Or, his crimes were brutal, but his personality left little for the public to cling to. He was terrifying because he was ordinary. For the families of Linda Brooks, Susan Clark, Megan Lewis, and Rachel Moore, the guilty verdict was bittersweet. They spoke about their daughters, sisters, and friends, reminding the world that they were more than victims. They had been kind, hard-working women whose lives were stolen. At vigils and memorials, candles burned in their memory. Though the town grieved, it also honored them, ensuring their names would not be forgotten even as Arthur Green's faded into obscurity. In Ashford, change followed the tragedy. The police force restructured, adopting new practices and working more closely with communities. DNA testing, which had been crucial in catching Arthur, became a tool that transformed investigations across the country. The case showed the importance of preserving evidence and investing in science. In that way, Arthur's crimes, though devastating, helped push policing into a new era. Inside prison, Arthur remained the same as he had been during questioning, silent, expressionless, unreadable. Guards described him as polite but distant, a man who rarely spoke, as if he had chosen to retreat fully into his own mind. Some believed he still felt powerful, keeping secrets no one else would ever know. Others thought he was broken, stripped of the life he once controlled. No one could be sure, because Arthur never explained himself. He never confessed, never apologized, and never revealed why he had done what he did. Over time, his name faded from the headlines. Other crimes, other stories took the attention of the public. Outside of Ashford, few remembered him. His story became known mostly to those who studied crime or who lived through the fear he caused. That was why some later called him Britain's most twisted killer you've never heard of. He was not a household name like others, but the cruelty of his acts and the emptiness of his heart made him one of the darkest figures in the nation's history. The survivors carried their scars in silence. Claire Morgan, who had escaped Arthur's attack, moved away from Ashford. She built a new life, but the memory of that night stayed with her. She told her story years later, explaining how she had felt the killer's presence behind her. How she had run with her heart pounding, knowing she was inches from death. Her bravery in escaping and in testifying helped bring him to justice, and for that, many in the town saw her as a hero. For Ashford, the story became part of its history, whispered by older generations to younger ones. Parents reminded their children to be cautious, pointing to the past as a warning. The streets where the murders had taken place were changed over time, new buildings rising, old paths closed, but the memories lingered in the corners of the town. Arthur Green's life ended quietly, years later, inside his prison cell. He died, as he had lived much of his life, unnoticed, ordinary, and silent. There were no grand statements, no final words. He left behind only the shadow of his crimes and the memory of fear. In the end, his legacy was not in his name, but in the questions he left behind. How could someone so normal-looking be so evil? How many others like him walk unnoticed through quiet towns? And why do some crimes fade from the nation's memory while others remain? Arthur Green was Britain's most twisted killer you've never heard of, not because his acts were less cruel, but because he hid so well in plain sight. He was proof that the darkest monsters are not always the loudest, and that evil can live behind the most ordinary of masks. The people of Ashford never forgot him, nor the lives he stole, but they also remembered the strength they found in the face of fear, the way they came together, and the way justice finally reached the man who thought he could never be caught. You've just seen another chilling story from the world of true crime, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom, and join us as we unravel more heists, mysteries, and untold legends. Don't miss what's coming next, because in the world of crime, the truth is always stranger than fiction.